Chapter 5, Osseous Tissue and Bone Structure. And osseous means bone, so we could say bone tissue as well. So bone is osseous tissue, and it's a solid supporting connective tissue. Overall functions: support, so structural support for the body, an attachment for muscles that would then move the body for locomotion, and for tissues and organs. So for example, within the thoracic rib cage, we have organs that are safely housed within, and the skeletal system also supports tissues and has supporting tissues, and then organs even in the abdominal cavity. Even though you don't see any bones anteriorly, ventrally there are sheets of tissue, muscle tissue, that attach to the rib cage and to the pelvic girdle to help support the internal organs. Protection. Excuse me. So as I mentioned here, the thoracic rib cage does protect the organs within the rib cage. Vertebra, helping support and protect the spinal cord. The skull, protecting the brain and other organs within the head. And the pelvis, protecting the pelvic cavity organs. Leverage. So bones function as levers to change magnitude and direction of forces created by skeletal muscle. So what this means is a skeletal muscle that will span a joint, meaning it reaches beyond a joint in terms of the attachment sites. Muscles are special tissues that contract. So when the muscle contracts, it causes a force across this lever, and in doing so will cause movement at that joint or that articulation. So through our muscles acting on levers or joints, producing forces that will move the bones, moving the joints, and thus moving our body. So locomotion, movement locomotion. Mineral storage, so calcium salts. This is calcium and phosphate ions. About 98% of our calcium ions, and calcium in terms of a solid material, is stored within our bones. So our bones are a huge reservoir of minerals. When these calcium salts are in solid bone, they are out of solution, or they have precipitated, they're solid, but they can be dissolved, as we'll see, to help supply calcium ion and phosphate ions within the body to be distributed by the cardiovascular system. More functions: actually all blood cell production. So red blood cells, RBCs, and white blood cells and platelets are formed in red bone marrow. And we have red bone marrow in the enlarged portions of many of our long bones, as we'll see, in the region of the bone that's referred to as spongy bone. Energy storage. So within long bones, there's often a space, a medullary cavity, that is used for storage of fat, which is called yellow marrow. And depending on how much fat energy storage we have, will be mirrored by how much yellow bone marrow we have within our long bones. Okay, overall structure. So a bone, a living bone in your body, is technically an organ because it has connective tissue, the bone, osseous tissue itself. At the ends of the articulation surfaces, joint surfaces, there's hyaline cartilage. The bone is covered with a sheet of periosteum, which is connective tissue. There is smooth muscle tissue within the blood vessels supplying the bone. And then the bones are innervated, so there's nervous tissue within a bone as well. And you know that if you've ever broken a bone, it definitely hurts. So If you remember, the definition of an organ is a structure that is made up of different tissue types. So bones are connective tissue, bone or osseous connective tissue. Osseous refers to as bone. And there's also cartilaginous connective tissue, as I mentioned, the hyaline cartilage at the articulation ends or the joint ends, and then fibrous connective tissue, the periosteum, which covers most of the bone on the outer surface except for the regions of articulation. And there, the bones are covered with primarily hyaline cartilage. So bone has specialized cells, as we'll see, that produce the hard bone material, but also reshape and or remodel the bone. It's connective tissue, and if you remember on the tissues chapter, one of the characteristics of connective tissue is the abundant extracellular matrix. In fact, what you think of hard solid bone is primarily all extracellular matrix infused with calcium salts. And then there's vascular tissue as well, the blood supply. So the matrix, excuse me, they are proteinaceous fibers, protein fibers, primarily collagen, and then the ground substance, which initially is similar in consistency to cartilage. In other words, it's semi-solid or semi-liquid. And then once it's infused with the calcium salts, it becomes a hard ground substance, which we call bone. So that solid matrix is due to the calcium salts being deposited within the matrix, making it a solid, hard material, as opposed to the more rubbery material in the extracellular matrix of cartilage. So looking at histologically how the bone is organized. So the matrix is mostly calcium phosphate. So again, the matrix is the extracellular material, the fibers, and the ground substance. So calcium phosphate, don't worry about the chemical formula, but the calcium phosphate produces or is about 2/3 of solid bone mass. Living cells, or the cells within bones, make up only about 2% of the bone mass. And then, as the textbook mentions, calcium phosphate combined with calcium hydroxide makes another solid bone matrix material called hydroxyapatite. So just be familiar with these two terms. Hydroxyapatite, calcium phosphate are the two minerals that store calcium ion in bone. There's other calcium salts and ions that are also incorporated, but focus on calcium and then these two mineral forms of calcium, solid mineral forms, calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite. Oh, this all came out at once. Okay, so the collagen fibers, the proteinaceous component of the extracellular matrix, is about 1/3 of bone mass. So combining the solid calcium salt matrix with the proteinaceous collagen fibers, meaning they're proteins, the collagen fibers combined give bone unique characteristics. So bone is tolerant to compression. In other words, bone is really strong in resisting compression forces. Imagine jumping up and down and you're compressing the bone in the lengthwise direction, and bone is very strong and tolerant to compression, and that's primarily because of the calcium crystals, the calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite. But bone is also resistant to twisting and bending forces, and that's primarily to collagen fibers, which give bone some flexibility or bendability, and also prevents bones from being too brittle. In our lab component, you'll see this diagram this little wedge that's cut out of a bone, and this is analogous to this portion of the model here. So what we have here is a cross-section along the long axis of a bone. That would be the cross-sectional portion of the bone shaft. If you've ever had beef soup, you maybe have a beef soup bone in there. It looks like this. If we zoom into just a wedge of this, we see that this part of the bone is solid bone, which you see here. And then this part that kind of looks like little struts, little pieces of bone, kind of a somewhat spongy appearance, that lines the inner part of the bone, where the medullary cavity is that houses the yellow bone marrow. So that's what we see here. This portion of this bone section is solid bone or compact bone. And then this relatively small portion here that kind of looks like Swiss cheese, that is the spongy bone we see here. And these things that stick up, they're just pulled out in a way, and they kind of look like a wedding cake. That's one of these things. And this is the structural functional unit of compact bone. And as we'll see, these things are called osteons. And then cross-section and osteon has this kind of circular appearance, kind of like a tree trunk that's been cut, and you kind of see the growth rings on a tree trunk. That's this circular arrangement of bone material in the osteons, these things, of compact bone. Okay? So that is what we see here. All right. Oh, so I found this cool picture, this picture of concrete cement being poured over reinforcing steel rebar. So this is kind of analogous to why and how bone is so strong. The rebar would be analogous to the collagen fibers, and the bulk of the solid bone is the calcium salts, calcium phosphate and hydroxyapatite, that get surrounding and immersed around the collagen fibers. So combined, the collagen fibers with the calcium salts give bones a lot of strength, compressional strength, but also some resistance to bending and twisting, and that's what rebar does within concrete. Okay. And by the way, the calcium phosphate and the hydroxyapatite, the calcium salts, and the collagen fibers are all external to the cells of bone. This is all representative of the matrix. So the cells of bones are called osteocytes. Cyte for cell and osteo for bone. So these are our mature bone cells that are found within living bone in little spaces that are called lacunae. Just like what we saw in cartilage, the cartilage cells are called chondrocytes, and they're found within little cavities or spaces called lacunae. So the lacunae term is the same. So the function of the osteocytes is to maintain the protein and crystal structure of the matrix of bone. They are found within the lacunae, between layers or sheets of the matrix, if you think of it that way. And these layers of the extracellular matrix, the hard bone material, are referred to as lamellae. Lamella is singular. So those tree ring-like structures that we see here, these circular arrangements of matrix, hard bone matrix, are circular concentric lamellae. On the outer edge of bone, the lamellae are more like a sheet as opposed to a circular columnar structure, and that's referred to as circumferential lamellae, as we'll see. So there's little spaces between the solid matrix that allow connections between the individual osteocytes that are encased within the bone, and those little connections are called canaliculi. Literally, this means small canals. So as the osteocytes produce extracellular matrix that gets infused with calcium salts and that becomes solid bone, the osteocytes get encased in a space called the lacunae. And the canaliculi are the little canals between the solid bone matrix that connect individual osteocytes within bone.